So I'm JD Winteregg. I'm going to use a lot of language that I hear in academia. I'm going to try to define the terms as best as I can. If I'm talking about something and you just have no idea what I'm talking about, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to kind of give you a quick overview of what it is. I want you to know some of the main names associated with teacher education. A lot of us know the main names on the right. You know, we have the Glenbecks, and then we also have the Austrian school champions. We have a lot of names we know on the right, but on the left we don't know other than maybe Bill Ayers. We need to really get down to who is influencing the people in education. I want you to become familiar with the stated goals of teacher education. They're very explicit about what they want us to do as teachers, what they want us to teach others. And I want to identify possible ways to combat the leftist monopoly in teacher education. Because let's be honest, there's not really any conservatism there. Especially during election times, all the professors show up with their Obama pins and the union pins, and you know, it's pretty much frowned upon to believe in God and be a conservative. So who am I? I'm a French teacher, which is kind of weird, being a conservative. You know, typically my area is dominated by very leftist thinking females, and I'm a right-wing male. So it's kind of interesting. I hold a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Business and French from Ohio Wesleyan. I hold a Master's degree in Foreign Language Education from Wright State, a Master's degree in French from Ohio State, and as was mentioned before, I've completed my coursework in the PhD program at Ohio State. I still have to do the exams and the dissertation, but I'm thinking about abandoning that because there's really no way to, I guess, get ahead career-wise in education anymore. With the move towards adjuncts, just supporting a family, you can't do it. It's the reality of the situation. Yeah. And you know, I'm faced with the reality of school loans and whatnot, but at least I have this knowledge and I can share it with everyone, which is the most important part, I think. My experience, I've taught since 2004 pretty continuously. I think there was 1 year I took off to work in the business world. I lived and taught in France. So after I graduated from college, I moved to France and I taught English for a year in their school system. I've taught at the Ohio State University, at Cedarville University, and at Cedarville I developed their online language course. I've taught in the Clark, Shawnee, Urbana, Dayton Public, Northmont, National Trail, and Ohio Virtual Community School Districts. So I've had experience in urban, suburban, rural, super rural, for all you Preble County people. I have a wide range of experience in education or in teaching that I think is unique. Real quick, on the paper you'll see I left a space for an exercise. I'm going to do something with you guys. I want you to read, I'm going to show you the 14th Amendment, Section 1. I want you to read the underlined part in the section, and with the person next to you, I'll give you about 1 to 2 minutes, I want you to discuss what you think that means in terms of education. I'll go through the presentation and then we'll revisit it, and I'm going to have you do something when we revisit it. So right now, take about a couple minutes. The underlined part specifically is what I want you to focus on. You can focus on the whole thing if you want, and then we'll come back. So you got about 2 minutes. And you can discuss with people next to you. Okay, so I'm going to ask for maybe 2 or 3 people to share their views of how the 14th Amendment is related to education from your perspective. I thought I heard some bits and pieces of good conversation, so I know you did something. Yes?
It seems that you're not allowed any choice. You're told you live here, you go to school here.
Right.
For a lot, I mean, some people have the money where they can go to a private school or whatever, but as far as school goes, it talks about the state shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. You don't have the liberty to go find the best school to take your kid to unless you have the money to pay private schools.
Or unless school vouchers are available, I guess.
Well, it depends where you live.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes? Ms. Cox?
I had a list of how the school breaks that.
Okay.
Okay.
They take your tax money.
Your property.
They make, your property, they make education compulsory.
Okay.
They force curriculum, and they force an educational track for the children, and the teachers have no autonomy in the classroom.
Okay.
Not to mention data mining.
All right, and I'll have one more.
The state determines methods of teacher evaluation, and they're not educated to make those decisions.
Right. You guys are very sharp at dissecting this. I want you to, yeah, you are. I want you to keep this all in mind. Make sure you wrote down what you heard or what your thoughts were, because we'll revisit it from a different context. So, when, actually, I'll go ahead. With this so far in education, what's dominated the discussion is the focus by activists like yourselves on curriculum and building standards, the Common Core, essentially is what it is. For me, I believe we need to begin to look at who's responsible for the development and implementation of standards and curriculum. So we're looking over here, or there's a force over here working behind closed doors. I think we need to look here. In academia, we call it the gaze, G-A-Z-E. They have us looking one way when we should be looking the other. So identifying the gaze is important in academia. We need to look at teacher education programs, which are teaching teachers to teach. And we need to understand how they've evolved into a leftist mouthpiece. Like I said, I've been through the program. I've got a bunch of books I'll show you, a bunch of titles of articles that's mandatory reading. Nowhere in there is there any conservatism considered. In fact, it's critiqued heavily. And they call it critical lit theory. And the critical literature is critical of capitalism. We'll go into that. We need to understand that they operate under sociocultural, post-structural, and post-colonial paradigms. And I'll go over what those mean. But these are the primary framework of teacher education. And this is how they approach things. And when I go through this, you'll be able to look elsewhere too. I mean, education, everybody goes through the education system, right, in universities. At the other end of it, people like Obama will begin to make sense from this paradigm. It'll make sense why they do what they do. So I hope you get that sense when we're done. One thing in academia, when you critique something, you're supposed to identify your premise and where you're coming from at the beginning. And they do that in the articles. They do it pretty well. It's just not what I like. My approach, my premise, I'm a Christian conservative, so I approach things from that lens. I believe in the notion of inherency, and by inherency I mean there are things ingrained in you that's natural, God-given, not influenced from the environment or from your outside forces, just things that are inherent. I believe that environments can help to shape people, but they don't define who we are. And you'll see that's an issue with academia, and I also believe that when talking to people we need to identify our premises. One issue we see when talking to people on the other side is we haven't discussed where we're coming from. So if someone's arguing from here and someone's arguing from here, it never matches, right? We at least need to align our premises so we can have a civil discussion. And just a side note, if you ever go back and Google Phil Donahue and Milton Friedman and watch them talk and banter, Phil Donahue is left of Stalin, right? Milton Friedman is super right-wing, but they are so polite and witty, and that discourse is something I'd like to see revived rather than just the yelling. Part of the yelling, you know, drives fundraising. I understand they keep us divided, they keep their positions, yada yada. I think we need to start to combat that. So understanding the agenda, we need to understand the framework, the current paradigms used, and once we understand this, it'll help clarify the true intent behind teacher education. So again, it's teaching teachers to teach. So, first I'm going to talk about the prevalent dominant paradigms in teacher education today. So I mentioned sociocultural theory. It's the theory that society and culture are what shape people. The interactions people have with their culture and the people within their culture explain their development, right? So it's environmental influence on the person. Cognition exists as a product of a person's interaction with his or her surroundings. So cognition meaning what's in your head, what you're thinking. That exists as a product of your interactions. So I think I'll get into this later, but some people claim that under sociocultural theory that we're all influenced by our environments, so our thoughts are influenced by our environments as well. It's like not an inherent thought in our mind, it's all constructed from our environment. It's kind of crazy when you go through that. You think, is anything I say really my words? But then you get over that pretty quickly. There are three parts that Warsh identifies in sociocultural theory. There's cultural, historical, and institutional. So a lot of times when you hear politicians talk on the left, you hear them talking about the institution, talking about how the institution influences a person, because they get it from the sociocultural paradigm. And I guess I was fortunate enough to be a language teacher. I've learned that language is the key tool in sociocultural theory. It's the key way people use to shape others. It's the primary method, language. So being a language teacher, it's just rampant with this, how you shape students and whatnot through the language. And if you think about the left and how devoted they are to language, to the narrative, they view this as extremely important because you can shape people and societies this way. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is one thing. It came up in high school for me once, and then it came up in the PhD classes. This is big in the world. It means, essentially, the growth and development of an individual follows the same pattern of the growth and development of a society. So they are believers in ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I just want to throw that in there because they use it. So if it ever comes up, you can be really smart and be the only one in the room who knows. So the participants, so I told you I wanted you to know who people were, players in this game. One is Bakhtin. He's a Soviet guy. Talks about the notion of voice. And voice, not the audible thing you hear, but it's the speaking personality and the speaking consciousness. It's basically who you are coming out, that's your voice. So a lot of the time, you hear on the left, finding your voice. It's finding how you come out to express yourself. And we're struggling a lot with finding our voice on the right, particularly in the liberty groups. And you see that we're fractured in a way. But this is something that once you get it, you can refine it and express it. Vygotsky, how many teachers are out there? How many of you have heard of Vygotsky? He's pretty, the big thing about him is the zone of proximal development where kid can't get from point A to point B without the teacher there to get him there, right? But basically he believes that the higher cognitive activities, so the higher order of thinking, emerges from social interaction. The way people learn is just solely through the interaction, through their environments, through language. They use him primarily as the zone of proximal development. It might be something you want to write down. Erving Goffman, not well known. He's the guy, I'll show you the book. Presentation of self in everyday life. He kind of takes from Shakespeare's notion of the world's a stage and we're all players. And he talks about how in our lives we create little plays, essentially, where we have a front stage and a back stage, and we have our circles, and everything in our lives can be described by these circles, by these little plays that we do. It's fascinating if you ever want to read it. James Warsh, he calls it mediated action, but basically it's tools or anything we use to interact. So tools and language shape and determine human actions. So sociocultural theory, in a nutshell, we're all products of our environment. All of our cognition and identities are tied into our interactions with our culture and people within our culture. Our cognition is determined by language, which is the main tool in human development, and also how our environments utilize this tool. It shapes us as humans, how people around us use it. Because we're shaped by our environments, knowledge can only be defined as what we perceive based on our personal interactions with culture. Meaning truth is subjective. And by subjective, I mean you have objective, which is kind of like an impartial view, and subjective is it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Heavily weighted towards one side.
Bias.
Biased, thank you. That's the word. Heavily biased. So we only see and know what we've experienced. So truth doesn't exist. Truth only exists in our minds as we see it. That's what truth is. So when you think about this in terms of education, it gets a little scary, I think. Moving on to post-structural theory. In a nutshell, I'm going to be more abbreviated with this. It's the notion that texts can have multiple meanings and interpretations based on the diverse backgrounds of readers. It's the idea that the text could be read as having one meaning. The idea that I read that wrong. The idea that the text could be read as having one meaning is rejected. So the author intent is rejected. Basically what it is my approach, how I read the text, is the right way to read it. No truth is known other than the subjective truth I impart on the text. So where have we heard that lately? You ever seen our president in his interpretation of the Constitution? That's post-structural. And this, I get so worked up thinking about this. This is how you take the author intent out of it entirely. I once asked the teacher, why can't we, if I write my own text, why can't I reference my own context with that? And he said, because the I, when you wrote it, is different than the I you are now. The I, when you wrote it, is different than the I you are now. So I'm not the same person I was when I wrote it, therefore we cannot judge its intent. Kind of blew my mind,
Yeah.
Who are the major players? Roland Barthes. He believes that language doesn't have one meaning in which the reader can grasp the truth or reality. And there's also Jacques Derrida. He's famous for il n'y a pas de hors texte. There's nothing outside context. So the text by itself, if I just threw this book on the ground, it would be nothing without the context I bring. So the context of the author, what Goffman meant when he wrote this, has no bearing at all. It has to do with the context I bring to the text. So that's post-structural thinking. So these are two French guys, believe it or not. I would encourage you to read some of their stuff. It's arduous, it's hard to get through, but there are things you can highlight that just every once in a while will pop up and really strike you. Finally, I'm going to move on to post-colonial theory. In brief, post-colonial theory seeks to undermine the imperialist influence, and imperialist here is code for Western white male. In particular, the focus is on the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressed are all marginalized groups. These groups are on the fringe because the Western white male exploited his power to push others to the fringe. Power structures within the society are identified and criticized based on the white privilege and white power, how we dictated it went. So a lot of this post-colonial, a lot of it is post-colonial because you think of the French, and I was a French guy. The French colonized North Africa. They tortured a lot of the people in North Africa. And then the North Africans liberated themselves. And then you had these emergent authors like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. Fanon is someone Obama identifies. I brought that book for you. The Wretched of the Earth, he wrote this one. He also wrote Black Skin, White Masks. Basically, he talks about how the black people need to rise up against the white man because the white man was a great oppressor. And it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's post-colonial nature. This right here is probably the most prevalent right now in academia and education. So going back to, the participants, Edward Said, he discusses Orientalism and the notion of the other. So Orientalism only exists because the white man decided that something was foreign and Oriental, so we're Occidental, they're Oriental. The Occident can't exist without the Orient. That kind of thing, it's really kind of weird. One thing that's funny about this whole notion of Orientalism and the other is basically people on the fringe. So you think of the LGBT movement, you think of the Occupy movement, those are people on the fringe. I teach French, and it used to be called the Ohio Foreign Language Standards, but because foreign implied, it gives this white perception that foreign is bad, they changed it to world language standards. So we're eliminating foreign from our vernacular because it pushes others into the realm of the other. Kind of interesting. Most of the current theorists, feminism, LGBT, race, they use post-colonial theory, and it's the prevalent or the dominant theory in education right now. It's what Obama uses. To sum it all up, sociocultural paradigm, people are constructed by and are products of their environments. Post-colonial paradigm, there is no truth. Meaning is determined by the person interpreting. And the post-colonial paradigm is oppressor versus oppressed. People who operate on the margins are only there because they're exploited by the dominant class. and the dominant class is the white male, essentially. So how does this fit in the context of teacher education? Why am I bringing this up? Are you guys good with the background with these terms? Okay, so moving on. So I tried to put something in one paragraph that kind of gave an all-encompassing of all the paradigms. So students are products of their environments, which is sociocultural, and because of their diverse backgrounds, there's no way we as teachers can impart any kind of truth on these students, which is post-structural. As teachers, we can't, because we don't understand their truth, right? To better understand their backgrounds, we have to understand how the dominant class has positioned the students where they are, which is post-colonial. And we have to ensure that we're equipping all students to fight the class and institutional structure that placed them where they are.
So everybody's a victim?
Yeah, and we'll get to that.
Everybody's a victim, except white men. Except white men.
I actually had, this is a funny story, I had someone, I brought something up in class, and this girl next to me talked, she turned to me and she goes, you know what, you had your turn, you need to be quiet. Meaning, I'm a white guy, I was the only white guy in the class, and yeah, it was pretty funny. Excuse me?
You were the only white guy in the class?
Yeah, foreign language education. Like I said, I'm an anomaly, you know.
Yeah.
A male
You're white
language
guy,
teacher,
that's
a white male, conservative. It's like a unicorn. So how does this fit in with the goals of teacher education? You have a question?
How is this similar to postmodernism as far as the truth? There is no truth.
Yeah, I mean, post-structural, postmodern, a lot of people, they use them interchangeably. But identified in teacher education is post-structuralism. So I want you guys to have the terms so you can whack them.
Does
Yeah.
anyone question any of that they're being taught?
No, it's bizarre. I have.
Yeah.
And usually it's just kind of like silly Christian, you know, you don't know yet, you'll get there kind of attitude. Yes, sir.
Where do you date the term postmodern? Like, where did it start? If you have a starting point, kind of?
That's a good question. I have a book I can look. I'll actually have my assistant Marcus look it up.
Yeah, 20s, 30s.
I can probably find it in the back.
Postmodern is really very late
Yeah.
20th century, because they date modernism, everything from the Renaissance, Enlightenment period up to the beginning of the 20th.
I mean, generally, it started, I think, in the 60s with all the revolutions that you had.
I agree. The 1967, from here, anybody 53 and younger, to me, is postmodern, because when the 67 Grand Prix came out, they were about 6 years old. They didn't see the changes of some of us people that have watched the car. So that, to me, is when postmodern started. Like you said, later 60s. And you're right.
No, I mean, if you
Our
think of
products.
academia, that's pretty much when the change happened with the revolution. The left had their revolution, and I think we're seeing it happen on the right now. I think you're seeing what the left had in the 60s, the right's having now, which to me is exciting and needed to happen. Freire, this is what he wrote. Oppression, wreaking violence upon others and forbidding them to be, are likewise unable to be. And withdrawing from the power to oppress and crush, the oppressed, struggling to be, restore to them the humanity lost in the use of oppression. What? It's the second part that makes sense. This is why only the oppressed, by achieving their liberation, can liberate the oppressors. The latter, as oppressing class, can neither liberate nor be liberated. So the white man, traditional types, the conservatives, they're the oppressors. We don't know that we're trapped, that we're in a prison, and it's up to them to liberate us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets better.
How'd you sit there all?
I know. How did you?
Like this,
I would have been like, what?
white-knuckled. And then he goes on to say, this is why I personally look forward to a time when it will become even easier to wage the democratic struggle against the wickedness of capitalism. Capitalism's the devil in academia. That's the product of the white man exploiting the oppressed class. The goals in teacher education, the stated goals, it's kind of a real agenda in public education, is to empower the oppressed to liberate themselves and their oppressors. So it's good for us too when they do that. And I talked about Henry Giroux, which this guy, he used to teach at Miami University. He's a local guy, but he's well known in academia and teacher education. And I've got a short video, hopefully I can pull up and show you. If not, I can just pull it up on my phone and you can listen to him. But he says pedagogy is seen as a moral and political practice crucial to the production of capacities and skills necessary for students to both shape and participate in public life. Public life. The goal is for students to engage in public life, right? Not private life. So the book we had to read was called Theory and Resistance in Education. This one right here. And then the subline, Towards a Pedagogy for the Opposition. The opposition meaning the opposition to capitalism.
Sounds like a mental illness.
Who was it? Michael Savage would say that.
Savage.
Wrote the book.
So I've got a long quote I'm going to read to you and then go through. This is still Giroux. At the very least, radical pedagogical work, so radical pedagogy is his thing. It's what teachers need to push on the students essentially in order to fight the capitalistic structure. Radical pedagogical work proposes that education is a form of political intervention in the world and is capable of creating the possibilities of social transformation. Keep in mind, we're talking about what is education supposed to be. Rather than viewing the teacher as teaching as technical practice, radical pedagogy in the broadest terms is a moral and political practice premised on the assumption that learning is not about processing received knowledge. I'm going to repeat that. Learning is not about processing received knowledge, but actually transforming it as a part of a more expansive struggle for individual rights and social justice.
There's a transformation.
Social justice.
I think it was Rush just said the other day that everything that liberals do and believe is political. Everything.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what this is.
They can't separate. They believe everything is political.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. You read, it's not about processing received knowledge, but actually transforming it. Transforming the knowledge. Because knowledge, remember, is what we see. It's not anything that's true out there. Yes?
So let me ask you a question. In the course of your formal education, were you in the classroom downgraded or even failed on your papers or your projects because of your personal perspective and your point of view?
I never failed because of the grade inflation that's rampant, but I might not have gotten an A, like a B+, kind of like, you're almost there, JD, but...
Because I think it's interesting that Ward Churchill at the University of Colorado can say anything that he wants from a maniacal standpoint, and somehow he is backed as it being the course of education and, quote, debate, where, like you said, I mean, I've known people from the conservative side who have written papers and have literally had to drop the class because they could not pass it because the professors would not accept their point of view.
And from the professor's standpoint...
Even though it was logical.
From the professor's standpoint, they may be thinking, well, this person doesn't understand the white privilege and is not writing from the context of understanding the white privilege. So the goal of the course is to get that, and this person didn't get it, so we failed. Yeah.
But it seems like you turn around and say, well, you don't understand my truth, teacher, so how can you actually, the way I'm reading it, I should get an A, so just go ahead and give me an A because you don't know what I'm writing. Only I know what I'm
You know what the problem with you, though, is? You're a white male. You're the oppressor. So continuing this quote, this is all one long quote, remember? This implies that any viable notion of pedagogy and resistance should illustrate how knowledge, values, desire, and social relations are always implicated in relations of power. So when I talk about post-colonialism, the oppressed versus the oppressor, they view everything in terms of power relations. So I'll touch on this later. When we talk about race, to us, we think of race as color. I'm not going to discriminate against that person because I don't care if he's black. To them, they view it as power. We're going to discriminate against them because we're white and we have that privilege. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin. Where was I? And how such an understanding can be used pedagogically and politically by students to further expand and deepen the imperatives of economic and political democracy. The fundamental challenge facing progressive educators, and this cracks me up, progressive educators, they just assume we're all progressive. The fundamental challenge facing progressive educators within the current age of neoliberalism, and I'm going to define this term because this cracked me up as well. Neoliberalism, Giroux uses quite a bit. Have you heard of classical liberalism? Basically, liberalism in Europe is what we believe in, free market system. They've redefined it as neoliberalism. So we call what we call classical liberalism, they call neoliberalism. Neo meaning new. So that kind of is odd to me.
Yeah.
But you know, he's doing everything in the context of the United States, I guess. So the fundamental challenge facing progressive educators within the current age of neoliberalism is to provide the conditions for students to address how knowledge is related to the power of both self-definition and social agency. Any questions? I'm really itching to go to this next one.
Is there
Yes.
hope?
You seem to be quoting only males.
Yeah.
Are these all white males?
This guy's a white male. I've got a black male I'm going to quote. And then some of the articles I'm going to show you the titles of. A lot of females wrote those. So I tried to get the gamut. I don't want to exercise my white privilege too much. Central to such a challenge is providing students with the skills, knowledge, and authority they need to inquire and act upon what it means to live in a radical, multicultural democracy, to recognize anti-democratic forms of power, and to fight deeply rooted injustices in a society and world founded on systemic, economic, racial, and gendered inequalities.
So this is education.
This is education.
Kindergartners,
Basically, my role as an educator is to create little activists that fight for social justice. Whew. I'm sorry? Let's see. This was copyrighted in 2001.
Wow.
2001. This guy is still alive. He's still out there. He's in Toronto now, or Canada somewhere.
JD, this
Yeah.
explains a lot. When I went to my daughter's history teacher, who's a white male, former Marine, and you know, I thought he was a good conservative, and I said, why would you make these children read the likes of Howard Zinn, who obviously hates this country? His response was, well, we do have a pretty bad, you know, history.
Yeah, I actually have something that talks about that later. It touches on that point exactly. So, you're getting ahead of me.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Well, yeah, because I know a junior high teacher that is teaching their kids that Christopher Columbus was a bad guy.
Yeah, we brought diseases over and killed all the... resistance. So this is yours still. Resistance must become part of a public pedagogy that works to position rigorous theoretical work in public bodies against corporate power, capitalism, connect classrooms to the challenges faced by social movements, and provide spaces within classrooms, this really gets me, for personal injury and private terrors. Private terrors meaning anything the capitalists do to terrorize or oppress people. Private terrors to be translated into public consideration and struggles. Resistance must become part of a public pedagogy. So what's the agenda? It's resistance. It's part of the agenda. This guy's like a treasure trove. Unlike traditional and liberal accounts of schooling with their emphasis on historical continuities and historical development, critical theory points educators toward a mode of analysis that stresses the breaks, discontinuities, and tensions in history, all of which become valuable in that they highlight the centrality of human agency and struggle, which simultaneously revealing the gap between society as it presently exists and society as it might be. So they have an ideology they want to push. They want to bring out these poor issues of history that we have, because essentially it was the white oppressor that wrote it. By urging an attentiveness to the suppressed moments of history, critical theory points to the need to develop an equal sensitivity to certain aspects of culture.
Where did this guy study to get to this point?
This guy, that's a good question. He's got his PhD. He's a champ. He's a champ in this world. This is the guy we turn to if we want to know. Says the universities.
And this is the local guy.
This is Ohio State. Well, he taught it in Miami. This is Ohio State that's teaching this. And I know...
Does he still teach?
No, he teaches that in somewhere in Canada now.
He got the hell out of Dodge.
I don't think we ran him out though. I'm going to pull the video up on my phone and just play the sound. Will that work for you guys?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, this is Giroux. I just want you to hear in his own words how he talks. I'll send you the link, though. If we get the email thing, I'll send you the link to this.
That'd be great.
There's also a Bill Ayers link I want you to watch. It's like an hour or something, but you see why he's likable, and you see how he's dangerous, at least in my view. It's going to start in the middle of what he's talking, but you guys will catch on where he's going pretty quickly.
Freedom is a negative force, right? That people are ultimately responsible for their own fate. As if larger structural forces don't exist. As if the problems that people face, for instance, massive pollution, is caused by me, and not by the major corporations. And so there's what we've seen disappear in this discourse, which is to me the essence of the problem, is an inability to translate private troubles into larger structural public considerations. We have no way of understanding that link anymore, because what we've done is we've defined freedom in a way that suggests it's the freedom to do anything you want, screw everybody else. We've defined self-interest as the ultimate measure of what it means to take responsibility for yourself. We've made the claim that social responsibility is a pathology. But what you really need is, you need a new birth. Right? I mean, we need somebody else. I mean, we need a party that really says, hey, look, we don't believe society should be defined by corporations. We don't believe in this massive inequality in wealth and income. We believe in justice. Justice is something that shouldn't be bought. Everybody should have the basic social provisions that expands the possibility for their own agency. Everybody. That's a social issue. That's not just an issue of individual responsibility. So I think we have to draw a new map. We have to, in some way, embrace a new set of policies. We saw hints of that with the Occupy movement. We saw hints of it with the Quebec student movement, this year. We see hints of it in the No Idle movement among indigenous populations in Canada. And I think that that's a long march to the revolution, to the institutions. It takes time.
It says, where do we go from here? Is the title.
Education is at the center of politics. It's at the center. It's not just something that happens in schools. It happens all over the place. It happens in the cultural apparatuses. It happens here. In terms of this interview, it happens in terms of how corporations try to define what counts and what doesn't. And education has to be reclaimed. It has to have a very different mission and a very different purpose and a very different set of practices. It's not about methods. It's basically about educating people in ways to enhance their sense of critique, to expand the critical imagination, to lead them to believe that they can think, to think otherwise. In order to act otherwise, they have to think otherwise. And it also suggests that they have to do it collectively, that they can't do it individually. So you need a formative culture at work that once again reclaims all those things that matter in a civic culture. Compassion, justice, equality, the ability to relate to others in a way that expands and deepens the very process of democracy itself. And secondly, you need social movements that are broad-based. Broad-based. We can't, identity politics is fine, and it addresses specific issues, but we need broad-based social movements that address the totality of society. I think you gotta live standing up rather than on your knees, I think you have to believe in something other than yourself. I think that you have to believe that the world can be a better place and you need to fight for it. I think you have to believe that you can't do it alone, you have to do it collectively. And I think you have to believe that justice is going dead in us all the time, and we have to find ways to revive that. And we have to do it in ways that's compassionate, engages a notion of social responsibility, takes seriously what it means to be intellectually alive, and always to spark the imagination, and to always take a risk. I think you have to believe that you can't do it alone, you have to do it collectively. And I think you have to believe that justice is going dead in us all the time, and we have to find ways to revive that. And we have to do it in ways that's compassionate, engages a notion of social responsibility, takes seriously what it means to be intellectually alive, and always to spark the imagination, and to always take a risk.
JD, here's what's interesting about that. Spark the imagination.
Yeah.
When you read this stuff, there's not an original thought in their head. It's all a big string of BS run together that creates some confusion. It's Saul Alinsky-esque, repeated over and over again with a different set of moving the pea in the shell game. It's not even logical.
I mean, isn't that the irony of it? They talk about sociocultural. Everyone's
Yeah.
a product of their environments. No one has original thoughts, and they push this stuff out like it's original.
And then they talk about the social thing of it, that it's all societal, but they don't ever address that the main core of it is the breakdown of the family. They won't address the real issue of the societal.
They address family in the classes, and what family is viewed as is a perpetuator of capitalism.
That's right.
So since it's a driver of capitalism, it's obviously a driver of oppression. So break that up, you break up capitalism. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not hearing this right. What I'm hearing is that while denying, in my context, Christianity, which I'm sure he does, he's advocating for some of the benefits of people of faith,
Yeah,
but denying the source.
absolutely.
Am I hearing that, or is that?
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
So they want what
Christians do, or
Christians,
supposed to do.
yes, what is the ideal in the Christian life, but they deny it, so they have to make it a social justice
And
thing.
because it sounds Christian in nature, a lot of Christians have been pulled into this idea that the government, the apparatus of the government needs to take care of people, and that's God's doing, rather than us. I mean, you heard it with Kasich, right?
Yes.
But that's not
Meditative
too hard to see either, because they want the Christianity, the principles without the accountability. Their belief is that there is no God, they are God. So they possess everything that God does within themselves, therefore they can create their own destiny.
And when this is all Marxist based,
Right.
so Marxism is rooted in atheism.
Right.
So for me, when I hear Obama speak, I think he's an atheist. You know, obviously I'm not really supposed to judge his heart, I get that. But honestly, I think he prays in the mirror every morning. So the next guy we're going to talk about is Ernest Morel, which is this book right here. He wrote the book Critical Literacy and Urban Youth, Pedagogies of Access, Dissent, and Liberation. There we go. He discusses race and other, so he's a post-colonial kind of guy, race and othered cultures and how that should fit into educational pedagogy. So textual production. And when he talks about textual production, he says anything is a text. Words are text. Video is a text. Any kind of textual production should be about the business of social justice. It's about naming oppression, certainly, but it's also about eradicating oppression and injustice through the creation of counter-texts, critical texts that present alternate realities as they simultaneously critique the existing narratives that promote the status quo. And the thing that's interesting to me here is naming the oppression, right? Can you tell me, where do we see oppression named in education? You ready? Bullying. This is rampant. We're giving kids the language for oppression. And if you, this just drives me up a wall at school. Every kid thinks they're bullied now. You know, but it's taking these marginalized kids who feel like they're ostracized by the dominant power. The kids can't articulate this, but they can when they talk about bullying. They can in these terms.
Like all these theories are based on pointing blame instead of taking personal responsibility.
Remember, personal responsibility isn't what it's about. It's about the collective. According to Giroux. Morel mentions Gramsci. Gramsci is like he's an Italian kind of sociologist, and his big thing is cultural or hegemony, which is basically indirect forms of power or cultural imperialism. So it's not a force by the government coming in and telling you what to do, like what the French did to North Africa. It's pressure, societal pressure. So it's these, you know, you could say these hooded guys coming to a black house and burning a cross. You know, that's cultural hegemony. It's imperializing people culturally. You recognize that the media were powerful instruments of knowledge production that would be used by the powerful in society to configure social thought. And he has a pedagogy of the proletariat. And the proletariat is a Marxist term, meaning the worker, the blue-collar type. The pedagogy of the proletariat, the goal was to create citizens who were able to wrest the class privilege of culture away from the ruling class by expanding and restructuring the educational system. And we see this happen everywhere, right? Producing counter-knowledge through the manipulation of media tools is the mission of Morel's critical media pedagogy, right? He believes that new media technologies are the tools of the new class of urban youth, public intellectuals who may stand in opposition to the dominant classes who use mainstream corporate wheels to promote a hegemony, a domination of ideas that reinforces the neoliberal values, so the classical liberalism, the classical liberal values of capital accumulation and individual achievement. So he's pushing for his kids to fight capitalism in the urban. And I would argue people who are down and out in the urban setting, especially since I've worked in it, are there because of the government intervention, because of public intervention, not the private intervention.
Right.
Because the capitalism gives them the jobs and gets them out of there.
It does, but to them it oppresses, it keeps them down. It's the reason why they're stuck there. Children need to be exposed to texts that are critical of dominant value systems. They need to be given texts that provide counter-histories, so this is what we were talking about, and counter-narratives in general. They need to read texts that are culturally affirming, culturally relevant, and culturally responsive. And educators and policymakers need to keep these thoughts in mind when developing reading lists and grade level benchmarks. Moving beyond discussions of readability and award-winning titles, to also consider the potential of texts to foster the critical literacy development of students. So, does that sound like it's relevant to anything particular? Anything today, like the Common Core? And it's interesting what he says about standards, particularly social studies, and there's also language arts. But he references a journal by Westheimer, Kane, I don't know. Isn't there a NASCAR driver with the same last name? Kane, okay. Kane, I'll call him Kane. Social studies education needs to become more concerned with creating spaces for the development of justice-oriented citizens. But Morell also thinks we need a model of transformational civic engagement that extends across all content areas. So here he's advocating for social studies, talking about justice orientation. Not about history or what happened, because remember, truth doesn't exist.
Right, that's right.
That didn't happen.
Right. Yep.
It just happened the way they perceived it. So because we cannot identify or correctly identify the history, we have to make a push towards justice, social justice. On language standards, language arts standards, why is it not possible then to be fully complicit with these standards documents and to frame language arts curriculum entirely within a context of critical and multimodal literacy? These standards documents allow room for educators to engage in multicultural, Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial criticisms of dominant literary texts, to introduce multicultural and anti-colonial literatures into the traditional curricula. So when I look at the Common Core standards, my wife, I'm not really that affected by them because I'm a language teacher, I'm an elective. You know, I'm not language arts or math. But when I look at the standards, I read through them, they're very open-ended. I kind of feel like it's a step back, that they're more vague. I think they're more vague. They'll argue for the wiggle room for local curriculum decisions. But there's a stated agenda right there. When talking about the Common Core, I'm going to say my piece about the Common Core here. We need to be careful to articulate the difference between standards and curriculum. And this is where a lot of people on the right are getting nailed. We're using standards and curriculum interchangeably. They're not interchangeable. The standards to a teacher, when I put my teacher hat on, they look really good. You know, they look like they make sense. But I understand, and my opposition to it is a nationalized notion of standards leaves open the possibility of a nationalized idea of curriculum. I've lived and worked in France, I've taught there. With a nationalized curriculum, teachers become transmitters, not teachers. We're given a curriculum, we're told what to say, when to say it, there's a map for us, and then we impart that on the students. So my hesitation to Common Core is because it opens the door to these possibilities. Also, I think a greater analysis needs to happen with the Common Core standards. Talking to my wife, she teaches first grade. Just having a conversation with her, I asked her, her name is Amy. I said, Amy, do you notice anything from first grade, the old first grade standards that's different from the new first grade standards, the Common Core standards? She said, yeah, we don't teach money anymore, math. Thinking back, getting rid of this consumerist idea with the students, take money out, all of a sudden they're not focusing on purchasing goods and furthering this capitalist idea. Is that why it was taken out? I don't know. When you look at the list of the people who were there, I can only identify one teacher who was retired who had any of the standards. So I don't know, a bunch of National Governor Association people telling us how it's going to be. We need to be sure we control the creation of our local curriculum and standards, and I think that's the best way to halt the progressive ideological push. Because progressive teachers will fit their progressive ideology within the standards as they can. That's what we're being taught. And the thing that's scary to me is you have all these educators who are older, my parents' age. Not that it's old, it's still young, it's still really young.
Thank you.
My parents' age. Those guys weren't under this paradigm. They didn't in the 60s when the revolution was happening, they weren't part of this. So they have kids they're teaching, I think, in an objective way. They're retiring, they're moving out, and they're replacing them with teachers now who are taught under this paradigm. We're losing. We're going to lose our country. I firmly believe it, which is why I'm up here talking about this and telling you what we're... This is mandatory reading. This isn't made up. This isn't cherry picking anything. This is, you heard his words. And this is evidence we have that I think we can use to fight.
Is it for early education teachers as well?
What's that? Oh, I mean, these right here were all general ed.
Okay.
And then these articles right here were content specific. So...
This is the theory behind every application of education.
in every facet of education, not just teacher ed, every facet. Yeah.
So Cedarville teaching that way too?
I just did I was kind of in my own isolated. I would say no. My dad works there. He used to be a dean there, associate academic vice president. I know he didn't. But I know they've had some struggles with some people, particularly Bible teachers teaching that way. I don't know. I don't want to spread rumors. I don't know exactly.
Right.
I know from my friends who went there what they said. But I would imagine it's intruding. And one aspect that just blew my mind, I didn't even think about, my friend, a really good friend of mine, his name's Jordan Walker. He will be president one day, mark my words. He's down in Mississippi. He went in the JAG program after he graduated from law school, became a JAG lawyer. And he was telling me couldn't get his head around the fact that of what was going on in the military. Basically what's happening is these officers are getting educated under this paradigm and then going in as officers and pushing that in the military. So we're even losing that aspect, the protection aspect. That's why you're getting military leaders now that aren't necessarily as military as we thought. So I mean, it's everywhere.
That's all designed to destroy the Department of Defense. I mean, there's
to destroy America as we know it.
There's a
I mean,
method to
the
madness.
military is the vehicle of the oppressor. You know, it's
Right. In their view.
yeah. Sure.
You said the Common Core standards were not driving they're not the curriculum. However, if you look at the guidelines of how to meet the standards, how it's written, it sure narrows the focus and makes your curriculum fairly narrow. And then when you put the PARC assessments with it, it's going to
You've got the assessments with it where, I mean, schools that aren't wealthy, urban schools in particular, are going to be forced into purchasing curriculum that's cheap. And curriculum that addresses specifically the assessments, right? And this curriculum is already out there. It's Common Core curriculum, it says. On the, you can check it out on Amazon. I mean, what they're saying, oh, there's choice. Yeah, there's choice in Worthington and Upper Arlington where they can pay their teachers $90,000 a year. But in Dayton Public, there's not a choice. They have to go that route because of funding. And that's they don't tell you. So a lot of those people too don't understand or don't have the resources to develop their own curriculum. I mean, it's the political speak behind it. It's just better off to develop our own standards, in my point of view, to get away from it.
Right.
Amen.
So I anticipate people, aren't you just cherry picking authors in the teacher ed curriculum? No. Keep in mind the paradigms I listed at the beginning, and I'm going to go through some of the titles of books. Mandatory reading, right? So sociocultural, post-structural, post-colonial. One was the cultural nature of human development. Critical practice talks about all the theories. Language and culture pedagogy from a national to a transnational paradigm. So moving language from national to transnational. Voices of the mind, a socio-critical approach to mediated action. The Dream Keepers, learning to labor, how working class kids get working class jobs. It's a British guy. They're really big in the class system. Freire, I talked about. Pedagogy of Hope, it's the sequel to Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So he talks about dreaming and how dreams are lost in education, which I would agree to some extent. Mind and Society, the development of higher psychological processes, Vygotsky. Social Construction of Reality, a treatise in the sociology of knowledge. Here's a good one. Everyday Anti-Racism, getting real about race in school. And my favorite, Up Against Whiteness, race, school, and immigrant youth. That's just the gen ed stuff. So I have those classes with other teacher educators in math, etc. And then in my content specific, this is a stack. I just pulled it out. I spent 5 minutes looking for, I just pulled out a stack. I've got boxes of these at home. Some of the titles. So why do you want to teach French? Representations of multilingualism and language investment through a reflexive, critical, sociolinguistic ethnography. Constructing identity with second language. Pronunciation and attitudes among Norwegian learners of English. Capital negotiation and identity practices. Investigating symbolic capital from the ground up. The discursive co-construction of knowledge, identity, and difference. They all are sociocultural in nature. Narrative construction of teacher identity, positioning and negotiation. A sociocultural approach to understanding teacher identity, agency, and professional vulnerability in the context of secondary school reform. And on and on and on. Critical frames in educational research, feminist and post-structural perspectives. I mean, that's content specific. That's not even the general, Giroux, etc.
So is the English language going to be an oppressed language then?
We're the oppressors.
Oppressive, yeah.
Yeah, yes.
So let me ask you this. I know that Terrence Moore from Hillsdale College was successful in leading the charge in Indiana to overturn Common Core curriculum in that state. I know that John Kasich is behind Common Core here. How close are we in Ohio here to, are school systems falling in line like dominoes here, or is there opposition and resistance to try and do what Indiana did?
My understanding too is Indiana just kind of renamed what it was. I think that they only changed 8% of the standards. It's like 92% still.
Really, they didn't reject it in its entirety.
Like Oklahoma.
The impression I'm getting, and I'm just speaking for the areas I'm in, Preble County, we have a lot of Preble County activists. There's pressure locally to at least take a look at Common Core. I've talked to some legislators and they just don't understand it. One I've talked to, Andy Brenner. I know he's been the nemesis of a lot of people, but talking to him about 487, and this is the important part, is actually getting the discussion going. Talking about 487, he got that passed. One, he showed he can get stuff passed. Two, he stopped the bleeding with the Common Core. We can no longer get science, social studies. It's by law not permitted. So there are things happening, and I flat out asked him, would you consider introducing legislation to move from the Common Core to something we create? Because his criticism of moving to the Massachusetts standards was that they spend 30% more per student. So the Democrats politically are going to position themselves as, we need to raise taxes because we can't afford this. So I said, are you willing to introduce something that would move us to our own standards? If that's a criticism. He said, well, yeah, someone's going to, but yeah, I think I'd be interested in doing that. So I think we need to consider from our end how we reach our public, our representatives. There's been a lot of combating, rightly so. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what is the cost, the 30% more of it, because it's supposed to be a free thing that we could use?
I don't know. I don't know the cost.
Okay, we're not saying anything about 597, HB 597.
Right, Thompson's bill. He was pretty critical of it, said there were holes in it for funding. I asked him to send me the stuff, he still hasn't sent it, but I can send it on to you. I'm just trying to understand what's going on politically so we can position ourselves to support the right people and make the right pushes. Yeah.
It sounds like you're fairly convinced that the agenda is a liberal socialist agenda,
right,
and that teachers are pretty well trained in it when they don't even know that they're being trained in it. So they go along because they're being taught how to teach.
It's almost like I planted you in the audience.
Yeah.
Because I was going to talk about it. I had a conversation with my wife. I run everything by her. She's my, and if there are any grammar mistakes in there, it's because she didn't see it. So it's not. I was having this conversation, I was going through and she was giving me criticisms, and at the very end she's like, JD, you know what, like, I went through this, she went to the University of Michigan, really good school. She goes, this is a lot of stuff I heard in Michigan, and they frame it in a way that I think I'm a compassionate person, and when I see little kids that need help, I think I need to show my compassion to them, and I do these things. She's like, I had no idea it was in the context of furthering an agenda. And that's the problem, and that's actually, we'll do this activity here in a second, but what can we do to combat this? Get to know your local teachers. Many of them further the progressive agenda unknowingly. Many of them are excellent teachers, and you need to find and support the ones that do a great job and help educate them and help them fight the union influence in the schools. A lot of people are like my wife, myself included. Before I got into the PhD program at Ohio State, I was in the French department, and I worked on this project they were doing as a collaborative project to do, they called it vertical and horizontal alignment with standards, right? They named it the Common Core. Didn't know it at the time, but I was helping them with that. I go into the PhD and all this stuff happens with the Common Core, and it's like, oh crap, what did I do? And now they have a nice ambassador program they send out to the schools that I helped start. Sorry. But I didn't know, and a lot of the teachers have no clue that they're furthering an agenda. And where Morrell makes the point that within the standards they can promote progressive ideology, within the standards you can promote conservative ideology. Why not? You can do the same thing. And we need to encourage our teachers to do that. Get to know our teachers. Because a lot of them have the image that we're just a bunch of drum beaters, flag wavers, who are just angry. And a lot of them don't want to interact with the anger. And yeah.
Well, and I mean, it's true that this is not new. I mean, this basically started in the 1950s with John Dewey in the change. It just took him a few generations to get to the point where this ideology was entrenched.
Well, if the revolution happened in the 60s,
well, 50s really.
Well, they had a period of time to develop it and implement it in schools. Think about the generation that's the first generation to go through it. Right. My generation, right? What are the criticisms of my generation? Don't work hard. Occupy everything. Entitlement. I mean, that's how we were educated. It's because this is pervasive. It's out there. But a lot of teachers have no idea they're doing it. And we need to develop the relationship not only with the teachers, but I think with the legislators as well. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you're right in that it's really important, and like you said, unfortunately, it has to happen, but it's a good thing that we're recognizing what an important tool education is, and it almost seems like maybe the left beat the right to it, and I think a lot of people on the right complain about the media as well, and I've read some stuff, and they said, look, the left beat us to that too, and maybe they realize more quickly how important of a tool that is. So maybe instead of bashing the media, start to use the media, start to use it to our advantage. And I think that's what you're saying is, okay, so we understand what a tool this is, so let's develop a curriculum, let's use it to our advantage, let's, don't stomp out that side. Okay, we'll read your book. You're not saying that you're not willing to read something because you can look at it critically and not be persuaded by it because you have a good foundation, but we want to push our side too, we want you to read our stuff.
Right, and there's no use reinventing the wheel. They've perfected it.
Right.
There are two aspects of the media that I've seen. There's on the ground, what people talk about, and then what we see on TV. And when those two match up, then the narrative is pushed, and the narrative meaning the story. When they don't match up, it doesn't work. So when you think of someone like Ted Cruz, when he was up there filibustering, I think he was expressing the frustration of a lot of people. So what we were thinking and talking about on the ground didn't match what they were saying in the media, so the arrows didn't stick. We need both elements, and we have to understand that. When you think of the left, they're highly organized. They have organizational structures everywhere, community organizations, they're everywhere. And that's where they push the first layer of the media, because according to Morrell, text is anything, right? And then the second is what we see by the Mad Owls and all that. I don't take them seriously.
But their community organizers get paid.
Yeah.
Right.
Republican organizers and conservatives do not get paid.
Right.
We all go out and work
Yeah.
every day, 40 hours.
Right.
They get paid to go out and be political.
They're the useful.
And
That's right.
well, you figure a lot of the left too use younger people.
Yep.
Our generation. And from what I've experienced running for office, there is this, I don't know how to say this lightly, People on the right tend to view people like me as naive and not knowing what's going on and not understanding things. But that's not the case. We get it. We just haven't found the way to articulate it yet.
Right.
Put your faith in us, and we'll get things done. We've got the energy and stamina to do it. But if you think about my generation being raised with a trophy in our hands, told how wonderful we are, we get in the real world and they're like, get to the back of the line, buddy, you have no clue what you're talking about. We're experiencing an identity crisis. Where do we fit in? Where do we belong? Well, the left, they've got their arms wide open. The right, they're saying, get to the back of the line, you have no idea what you're doing. We're going to gravitate towards those who help us. You know, I don't think we're entitled to it. I don't want to give the sense that we're entitled to this. But we have to understand the structure of how the left has restructured everything. Yeah.
Can I just say that Saturday I was up at We the People convention in Columbus, and this kid, maybe some of you have seen him, he's been on TV and so on, his name is Charlie Kirk, K-I-R-K, and he's got a website, turningpointusa.net.
Yeah.
And he has, maybe you are acquainted with him, he's on the Ohio State campus, he's only 20, he's just really empowering. He's got them all over the place, he's working with kids, trying to work on issues. He's not trying to be political party or whatever, issues, so that they will change.
And one thing our generation is seeing is I think we are more issue-oriented than party-oriented. The Democratic Party, they're socialist, wholly socialist. We don't necessarily believe in the notion of giving away everything we earn, because when you get us to work, we like to keep what we earn. But the Republicans, you know, they don't want to give us any kind of voice. The fact that he's doing his own thing, issue-wise, that's someone we need to pick out and empower and prop up and turn to.
What was that website?
Our Turning Point.
turningpointusa.net.
Here, you can look at this.
Support him if you can, share it with others, because if we get this around so that we have thousands of youth, he's saying he has thousands already, so let's keep it
But,
up.
I mean, you look around in this room, I'm 32, Marcus, how old are you? 24. I'm assuming you're younger.
Don't ask anybody else.
28.
28. So other than 32, I mean, what's...
You really are a young whippersnapper.
I am. But we need young people here, you know? But people like me, I can connect to these people. Marcus can connect to them. And I'm sure you can. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. Lee. Lee, I'm sure you can. Yes?
How, you know, a lot of the superintendents and directors of curriculum, you know, they're all in their 50s and 60s. They weren't taught this. So how are they turning?
It's in terms of funding. So you get the race to the top funding, you have to do something that's career and college ready. Which, thinking about it, after doing this and thinking about college and career ready, what does career mean to them? It means vocational road, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean like a career in corporate America.
Yeah, they all think it's a 4-year degree.
Yeah.
But see, with Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind, see, we turned from a constitutional education, like you said, that we designed locally, to a UN-driven set of standards and curriculum that they bought into, like you said, tied to funding. So, you know, when we flipped that and we lost that control to buy into these programs, and Bush certainly didn't do us any favors with that.
But we can get it back, you know? You think about Obama, he transformed America in 4 years like that. It can happen again. It's just, they've got organization on their side. They've got enthusiasm on their side. And to be honest, I'm not enthusiastic about the Republican leaders.
No.
So what are we going to do?
Yeah, what are we going to do? How do you get the Republicans not to go along with them? I mean, I think they're in it together. I think they're being blackmailed. Something is going on for
I just
the
think
Republicans.
they're comfortable with their position of power.
Right.
You know, when you have Mitch
It's
McConnell
about
there,
them.
he's been there since I've been
It's not for a
born.
common good, it's about them.
Right. And
Both parties are extremely broken, and you're not going to fix those.
we need to identify and groom local leaders to move into that position. I said, I'm not going to support anyone who won't knock doors with me. It's not worth it. If you think you're above me, then you're going to use that. So that's the other thing I want to caution you of. If you're supporting young people, there are a lot of young people who are ambitious politically, who just want the political recognition. if you got someone like the Turning Point kid who's out there being active, I think that's admirable. If you don't see that out of someone, I'd say, if it were me, I'd say move away from them. Because we need to support people who are action-oriented, using what they use. I want to do the activity real quick, and then I'll do more questions. So understanding the post-colonial, sociocultural, post-structural, I want you to take a look at the 14th Amendment again, underlined, and see if you can, instead of having your own viewpoint, see if you can put on an educator hat, a progressive educator hat, and view what's underlined in terms of education. And then I'll talk about what I read. So the nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Progressive, teacher, educator, social justice, etc. You can talk about it if you want.
Status quo shall not stand in the way of new and progress.
That's your interpretation?
The status quo, because we can't deprive people of progress and modernity. And of course, progress and modernity all come from this secret enclave of people that know what the true truth is, even though they deny true truth.
You're on the right track. What else can we not deprive people of?
Property. And they are.
So if you're a socioculturalist, believe environmental construction, you're approaching this, you're viewing this, the Constitution, as a capitalist I read it and I think, property I have is protected. As a progressive I read that and think, we're entitled to property that's being deprived, or we're being deprived of this property we're entitled to. So in education they talk about access to modern amenities in the schools. That's the property they're being deprived of. And we need to go into schools and everyone needs to know everything because we're entitled to it. But if you extend that beyond education, it's scary. That is a very, I don't want to throw the C word out there, but it is. So that's pretty much what I've got for you. That's the agenda to summarize. Oh, the other thing I want to touch on to combat this, read their stuff. So we have the Austrian School of Economics. They have the Frankfurt School. These are all Marxists. You need to get into that. You need to read their stuff. It just make sure you don't have a heart issue. Or you have your heart medicine nearby. Because I feel it. One idea I had was a fairness doctrine in public education. So talking about how they use things, they were talking about a fairness doctrine and the radio waves. Well, why not go into public education where our money is using to fund these progressives and require that they teach both sides? Now, will it happen? Is it hard to measure? Yes. Will it happen? Most likely not. But it'll put a spotlight on the issue. I think it'll catch fire. If Boehner would do his job and come out and say we're going to implement a fairness doctrine in public education, man, the world would blow up. It'd be amazing. In summary, teacher education programs operate on sociocultural, post-structural, post-colonial paradigms. Universities teach that education right now is a means to prepare people for work, perpetuating the class systems and oppression that comes with it. So in order for us to be truly liberated from the oppressive nature of capitalism, we as educators need to empower our students to fight the social injustices. This thought is prevalent not just in teacher education, but also in all of education. So what's the real agenda in public education? It's to create activists, to empower them to liberate themselves, and to destroy this capitalistic perpetuation we have. So, yeah. Yep. Yes.
I said this a few times, as my kids graduate, they have parties and seniors will come over, and I've got lots of teenagers in the last 5 years, right? And I'll ask them, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? You'd be shocked at how many say, I want to work for a nonprofit.
Yes.
That none of them know what they want to do.
Right.
They just know they can't make a profit because that's evil. You'd be shocked at how many say that. When we were growing up, somebody asked me that, I said, I want to make $1 million. That's what we all said.
And the irony of it is, the people working for nonprofits now are making $1 million. That's
not a profit.
Yeah, it's not a profit, it's just money, it's salary. Yes, sir.
When you get this down to a verb, an action word, you said, get to know your local teachers. Well, your wife teaches. She comes home at the end of the day. Would she be willing to meet with a group of people?
I've actually asked them. They all are willing to meet with people because they're frustrated. A lot of them are frustrated. There are all these new things going on. Because what they don't talk about, the Common Core standards and the assessments, that's all tied into teacher evaluation. So when you have, my wife teaches first grade, and they, you know, these organizations that produce the tests that say they're valid. Okay, my wife teaches first grade, this is where they learn to read. First couple weeks of school, they come in, they sit in front of a computer and tell them to take the test. These kids don't know how to operate a computer because they're all using iPads. These kids don't know how to read. So they're just clicking everywhere. You know, and you'll have some students score really well, so the growth she shows in the year is very minimal. Some students score really poorly. It's not an accurate measure of what they know going in. So they're frustrated from the aspect of OTES, the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System. And that's where you can hook a lot of teachers to say, look, I understand the evaluation system's tied into these assessments. We don't like these assessments because they're tied into these standards that we had no say in. So let's work together to get in. You can join together with the unions. Now the NEA now is pushing out Common Core is good, and every so often, which maybe I should start forwarding to you guys, I get an email from the NEA that talks about a Common Core success story. And so, I mean, they're moving towards that, but most of the teachers on the ground are able to identify the bad behind it, and we can hook them.
Just having it again, but it's already successful.
I'm sorry?
What is the union's payback for this?
Oh, what do you mean? Like, what do they earn?
Common Core.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's
I mean, it's
collectivism.
supposed to be protecting teachers.
Yeah, I don't know. But honestly, my union at my school, we're all pretty conservative, so it's pretty inactive. They just take our money. $600 a year, and I'm just part-time. Yeah.
Hey, Judy, I was just told by a teacher that he has to pay his fair share dues, but that he somehow applied to get the money that's put into the political end of it to get that back, and he got a check for $400 of that $600. Got a check for $400 right around Christmas time.
Well, it depends on, I think, the school. I mean, I've asked about it. My guys are like, I don't know. They don't really know anything, so that's frustrating on my end. They don't care. I don't know why we have a union. But, you know, I've heard it ranges from like $1 to several $100s. You know, it depends on what they determine their political activity would be. But honestly, I mean, we get 2 glossy magazines per month. One for me, one for my wife. And that stuff's not cheap. Running for office, I thought I was going to put out glossy magazines. Just the mail alone. But yeah.
Could you expand a little bit on the testing for the students? How often are they tested?
I mean, I can speak for myself and what I see my colleagues do. For myself, I have to create SLOs, which are student learning objectives. Because I'm an elective, they don't have an automated test. So the ODE basically said, well, we don't have enough time to develop this for you, you've got to do it yourself. So they gave us parameters, and I had to develop my own kind of way I'm going to be evaluated. So I had to give a pre-assessment. I have to give a post-assessment at the end of the year. Our growth is measured on the ACTFL standards, which is the American Council for Teaching of Foreign Languages, which will probably change the world languages soon. But for me, it's just 2 tests a year. For others, I know they do map testing several times. They call it map testing. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. But I know they assess more often.
Okay, I had read somewhere, or someone, I heard a speech, that if a child does not pass a particular test, they get retested.
Right.
Then after several weeks or whatever, and that these tests cost a certain amount. Do you happen to know?
I mean, just from hearing Amy talk, I know my wife's an excellent teacher, but so she didn't have this problem. But other teachers she worked with, she said that they would have to take the test several times until they met the growth standard, so they could become accomplished. Because we have the different teaching levels now. Oh, it's like skilled is the proficient, skilled, accomplished. My wife and I both got accomplished, which is good. But we had to show that year's worth of growth. But a lot of people don't.
Well, I was thinking more for the students.
I mean, it's horrible. I mean,
the kids in the classroom.
In an urban,
It's called PARC.
there's PARC assessments for the.
PARC assessments.
I think she has STAR assessments.
4 times a year.
I think hers are called STAR. But working in the urban setting, in the with the OGT tests, they would take students out of my classroom, put them in a room a week or 2 beforehand, and just go over, this is probably what you're going to see on the test.
Was it the test?
Yeah.
No,
probably.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think we had the test ahead of time there. It was, you know, last year's test kind of, but they would remove these students from instruction this is an urban setting, you know, it's because they're that obsessed with meeting the objectives so they get their funding. You know, and that happens.
In one breath, I was just looking I saw a thing with Katie Couric, that they want to get away from the memorization. But then when they're going to the tests and they're going over the tests, that's all they're doing is getting them to memorize.
Regurgitate.
It's just contradicting.
Well,
But getting back to, oh shoot, I was going to say something else. With the testing, I mean, this has been going on for years and years and years, and it's just worse.
I read an article in my research that said before the testing culture happened, students performed better because they had that extra instructional time and teachers felt comfortable with what they taught. They didn't have these stressful standards or pressure to meet, and that was like 1990s, even then. Yeah.
I was just wondering if anybody in here knows about, I know districts are different, I suppose, but it's very hard to decipher between what is the park or, you know, the map, the things that you might want to opt out as compared to the assessments themselves, which maybe kids have to have. I mean, because how does a parent know? Even on Heidi Huber's, you know, Ohioans Against Common Core, it's hard to see. I mean, what she's got doesn't really cover it, doesn't really help.
They don't want you to know.
That's the other thing, they're making it to where parents
It would be-
are totally out of it.
It'd be interesting to see how much of this is incorporated in the testing, how much of the progressive notions are pushed in the testing.
You can't get real definitive answers to the questions.
But part of it is because a lot of them don't know the answer.
Yeah, that's.
You know, my superintendent. Yeah.
I have two boys in the Mason school system, one's in 5th grade, the other one's a freshman. And they have not really been announcing all of the tests that the kids are taking. So I sent a message to each school and I said, I want to know what tests they're taking on what day. And one of them, for my 5th grader, wrote back and said 14 to 15 assessments for the year. And that includes common assessments, maps, and park.
OAA, OGT.
Broken down.
Yeah. I mean,
So I'm trying to figure all this out too because I'm in the process of trying to
there's weeks worth of preparation for the assessments. You lose a week, or two, you lose a week in March for the OGT testing. I mean, if you really add up the amount of education, the amount of instructional time that's lost because of texting, we're like 2 years behind where we were.
That's why we're behind.
They should be telling every parent when these tests are taking place so that you can do something about it, and they don't do that.
No, and I think a lot of it is honestly that a lot of the people are unaware. A lot of the
Teachers, the parents don't know.
a lot of the teachers. I mean, there are a lot of people who just we're busy with our teaching. We don't really think to consider this. And you know, I think you guys are making very good points. I just want to make sure that when you approach teachers, and I'm saying as a teacher, it's done in a way of that's not confrontational. Because a lot of us, we just don't know. We don't know the answers. We understand your frustration, but you know, and it's just the directives from the state. You know, talk to the people at ODE. Talk to the people, our legislators. You know, it's yeah.
Who gives the directives from the state?
I don't know. You have the legislators who legislate, who have no idea what's going on with education. It tells us what we need to do in education. They pass it off, I think, I don't know if it's the state school board or the ODE, and the ODE is responsible for dispersing whatever the legislators say, so then they take a long time to figure out what in the world they're doing. So like with the OTES, it's like they just got frustrated and told the electives, do your own thing. I don't know. And that's the thing. I'm a teacher. I have no clue what the state's doing. I need to know. I need to know what's expected. Yeah.
During the summer, I went to one Westchester school board meeting, and some of the literature that you could pick up was the calendar for the year of the testing. Now, I didn't understand any of the alphabet codes that they had for the different testing, but it did have it laid out throughout the year. And my daughter-in-law is in education, and so I had her go over what grades for what. But so your school boards might already have the schedule for you that you could get.
So the test, I mean, I would ask your school board people, I mean, they might be able to pressure the administration. But as far as the rest of the testing, yeah, I'm not sure. I can't give you definitive answers. I can't answer stuff on progressivism in education. If you have any more questions about that, or do you?
You know, we were told at one meeting that we went to, it may have been the Glenn Beck seminar, but we were told the best mechanism or the best tool that we can use to defeat this right now, short term, is passive resistance. Just refuse to take the test.
Get the kids, yes.
I don't know much more. But we don't, Susan and I our children are all children, so we're not.
I would say if you're going to do that, make sure you organize and come up with a consistent message, so it's something that's put out there that they know what to expect when it happens. A lot of the issue with, I'm all for resistance, peaceful resistance. The left organizes before they do it. We just do it because we're that driven, we're that passionate about it. We need to make sure we're methodical about it and we're approaching it the way the left does. Because, yeah.
I pulled my son out and I chose a private curriculum, but it's at home. But our treasurer complained at the last board meeting that there was so much money leaving the district from students who were exiting for lots of reasons. They were going to schools that were open enrollment, don't know why, homeschooling, private schooling. So students are pulling out of the public school system. Maybe since this whole thing is money and agenda driven, we can't change the agenda overnight, but we can pull the kids the heck out and cause that money to leave. You know, they get less money. Maybe that's that passive resistance.
This is hard though, because the school vouchers I think are a great idea, but the charter schools that are popping up are horrible. Generally these administrators, the ones I've experienced, especially in the Dayton public, we got kids that were fed in from the charter and they couldn't read coming to 9th grade. I mean, there's a lot of exploitation of the money there. I think we need to be careful about that. You know, I've encouraged my wife to kind of quit and form her own consortium, because homeschooling wise, if you had localized kind of artisanal teaching, if you will, I mean, we're trending that way anyway with everything else. Why not do it with teaching?
But that's the problem. I mean, they say that our superintendent will say, we're a business, and you do whatever you have to do to make that parent happy, because we cannot afford to lose $1 out the door.
Right.
They haven't gotten that attitude yet.
You've had your hand up.
They just think they're going to have the money anyway.
The problem is we've talked about capitalism and how good it is, but schools are not capitalistic.
Yeah.
There's
They're
no
socialist.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Our schools, and the largest tax I pay, I've analyzed all my taxes. The largest tax I pay is my property tax that goes to the schools, and I have no choice. And so our schools are socialist, even though everyone here is saying how great capitalism is, but our schools aren't that. And capitalism produces better results.
Right.
So I think that's why school choice is a good idea.
I would agree with you. I mean, capitalism is choice on a free market, you know. Yeah.
Well, without capitalism, there would be no money to give to the schools.
Right. Yeah,
exactly. Thank you.
The schools and the people who put down capitalism, like churches sometimes do. Like, well, how do you think you get your money? By donations from the people who go to work every day. They don't get it eventually.
They earn their money by exploiting the capital of others.
If there's no capitalism, nothing's going to work.
I agree.
That's just your truth.
I'm a social worker, so all this stuff here, I learned 10 times over as a social worker and have now come around. So it's really hard when the left or social worker or whatever, you know, they play on emotions and they get lots of people over on that by emotions.
It's all about the kids.
But we, you know, I try to combat that. I'm compassionate too. I just come at it a different way. So, you know, and they organize more. So amen to that.
I mean, we're kind of at a hindrance. I mean, Christians were, I think, the greatest donors to charity, but then we're told not to talk about it.
Yeah.
Did you?
Well, I was just going to say, but the real thing is that knowledge is power.
Yes.
And, you know, thank you for doing this type of thing and educating this, because the real problem, and this was my difficulty in school, a lot of times we don't know how to defend what we believe or what we know to be truth.
Right.
And so...
What's inherent, right?
Right, and so that's where this is really good, because I think the larger that we can grow these groups, you know, the more commonality in mind, the more knowledge is shared, the more we're going to be able to figure out what to do.
And I sent, I don't know where it is, but I have PDF files of 32 pages just picked out from the couple books I quoted up here that I'll send to anybody if you want. I've got, I mean, all kinds of books. I can give you the list of books. You can go out and buy it and read it. That's the nice thing about this. We're criticized for just emotionally reacting. This is actual text. You know, this is what happens. So we have that to support us. And I want you to be sure you read it. Yeah.
Maybe it's good as Common Core came out, and because this has been going on for a long time, I didn't know all this was going on. So now people on the ground, like that's Common Core is uniting us, like to learn about this. So maybe it's good that it's got a name now, and people are waking up.
Name the oppression.
What's really going on?
Heidi's having another meeting tomorrow night to update everybody on what's going on with Common Core. It's, no, I think it's at Anderson.
It's tomorrow.
Oh, it's tomorrow night.
And Thursday, she's coming to Northern Kentucky.
Oh, tomorrow night.
Thursday night.
Everybody agrees, we've got common enemies here. For copies of JD's presentations, and I put everybody sign up for this. Kelly will be passing this out.
Will you just automatically send us those PDFs if we sign on there?
Put on as much as you want.
Okay.
That's what we need.
You might see my notes in there. They may not make sense, but that's perfect.
So if we've already signed that, we'll get a copy of it.
Sure.
And don't forget to, Glenn Beck's book is available over here. Brochures are available over here. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And